Hello, my name is Brink, Lindsey. I'm a vice president at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., where I am helping to direct our new center on state capacity. State capacity refers to the ability of governments to formulate and execute policy. We've seen a disastrous evidence of state incapacity in the United States over the past couple of years in our shambolic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as part of this state capacity project, we're doing a series of interviews with various experts covering different angles on what went wrong. A lot went wrong, so there are a lot of different angles, but we're delighted to kick off this series of interviews with Glen Weyl, who is the Microsoft Office of Chief Technology Officer, political economist and social technologist, or Octopest. Is that the correct title?
Yes, you got it, Brink. It's a mouthful.
That's very good. And your background, you're an economist by training. You got your doctorate at Princeton right on the heels of your undergraduate degree, as I understand. Then you were in academia for a while at Harvard and University of Chicago, but then Microsoft plucked you out of academia and you've been there ever since.
That's right.
Is that
Yeah.
basically correct?
Yeah.
The two of us met in 2018. We'd both written books. I had co-authored a book, books about the same basic problems, about the melees of slow growth and high inequality that is afflicting capitalism around the world, and the sort of crisis of democratic legitimacy that is growing out of that malaise. Steve Tellis and I wrote a more conventionally wonkish book in response to these problems, but you and Eric Posner wrote a book, Radical Markets, where you were proposing sort of radical rethinks of institutions, a new sort of a reimagining of rights to physical property, a reimagining of voting procedures, and other sort of radical institutional redesigns to make capitalism and democracy work better. Then the next time I saw you, you had surfaced at the Safra Center at Harvard University, which was engaged in a major endeavor to push a response to the pandemic. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got from authoring Radical Markets to pandemic planning, and how you got connected with the Safra Center at Harvard?
Well, Radical Markets wasn't a great commercial success, but it ended up having a sort of cult following in the blockchain community and the sort of government and technology communities. And that thrust me into activism, engagement with governments, engagement with the blockchain world. And based on that, the CTO at Microsoft brought me over to advise on geopolitical matters for the company, geopolitical, macroeconomic matters. And in the process, I got to be quite close with Audrey Tong, the digital minister of Taiwan. And we've worked on a lot of things. We're actually working on a book together right now. And I, when the pandemic started taking off, I noticed that they were doing an exceptional job of addressing it. And I pretty quickly started to think about how to bring to the attention of relevant authorities the example that they were setting and the things that we might learn from it. And
so just backing up very quickly, Audrey Tong is now a world famous digital activist who has become digital minister for Taiwan, has helped lead that country in some really exciting experiments in new forms of democracy and citizen involvement, and that was part of the equation for Taiwan's splendid response to the pandemic.
Yes, exactly. And so I first brought her work to the attention of leaders at Microsoft, but when it became clear that they weren't sort of able to quickly engage on, deploying those things, I wrote up a sketch of what I thought would be a thoughtful response for the United States. And I emailed it. Well, actually, so what happened first was that I just wrote up a case study about Taiwan, and I sent it to my friend Danielle Allen because I thought that she might be thinking about this question. And she helped me get it published in Foreign Affairs. And that was the first, I think, one of the first writings about the Taiwanese experience in the English language press. And at the same time, I started formulating a more comprehensive set of thoughts, and Danielle was thinking in the same direction. We
And
joined
Danielle
forces.
Allen, she was a professor at Harvard, and she was at the time the head of the Safra Center.
Right. And so based on those two convergent lines, we ended up putting together this task force. I became the technical co-lead, and she was the public leader and the writer of most of the documents. And we started bringing together scholars from lots of different fields and trying to synthesize all the thinking to advocate a comprehensive plan. And we ended up, I think, we had a few impacts, but probably the most important mimetic impact we had was sort of making a thing the discussions around testing, tracing, and supported isolation as key pathways to addressing
my then colleague Will Wilkinson was involved a bit in your effort.
Yeah, he did. He was. That's right. Yeah.
So the big sort of showpiece work product of your effort was a report, a roadmap for pandemic resilience, which, as I recall, it came out in April of 2020. So,
and we had a second.
It was already
one,
on fire, but it was still relatively early stages.
We had a second. We had a follow up, basically an addendum to that one as well, that made some impact. That was localizing it to state by state responses. So,
okay. So the initial roadmap. The plan was for large-scale testing, millions of tests a day, and then leading to which would then be followed up by contact tracing and supported isolation. So why don't you describe very briefly this road not taken?
So what pretty much all the countries that were successful in addressing the pandemic did was build sufficient capacity for contact tracing, which I would introduce, but I think it's familiar enough to people at this point. But basically, it's finding the people who might have been infected by someone who tests positive, and sufficient capacity to test those people that they were able to more or less suppress the disease. That was true in Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, China, etc. And the U.S. never got to the testing capacity that was even on the right order of magnitude to make that a feasible way to actually suppress the disease. In order to suppress the disease, you basically need to be able to trace the contacts and get to, and test all those people before the next transmission occurs. Because otherwise you're not, so that requires a certain rate of testing and a certain speed at which we would complete the contact tracing. And we never got to the testing capacity or tracing capacity that would allow us to do that. And the problem is it's a little bit like a military conflict where if you don't address the problem when it's small, then you get overwhelmed. And so it pretty quickly got to the point where it wasn't even going to be, like, we were just falling further and further behind over time. So the strategy failed worse and worse. And instead, we tried using lockdowns and so forth. The problem is that those, for a variety of reasons, weren't really sustainable strategies to address the problem and cope with it. They were only sort of stopgaps to find a way towards a more sustainable strategy.
So by the time your report had come out, it was relatively late in the day in pandemic terms. That is, it was in the United States. It was community spread all over the place. So the ambition of your testing and tracing initiative had to be at a much higher scale than the swift response in Taiwan and other countries,
Exactly.
because they were able to nip things in the bud. So the lateness required this big step up in large scale testing.
exactly.
And you tried your best to sell that to people. And you got meetings and you got interest. So tell a little bit about the insider
Well,
game
I
and how
think I
close
think
you
there
got.
I think there's a I think we came quite close. There was actually one day when President Trump was asked about our report and said that he was going to hit that target, that we were going to get there, and that we were going to beat the disease. And then that was disclaimed uh, by the admiral that he had put in charge of doing the procurement. Um, and there was a moment where it hung in the balance whether Trump was really going to like bring down the hammer on that, or whether he was going to let it uh, slide. And I think the most important thing that tipped it over the balance was that the Biden team then glommed onto it and decided to make it central to their campaign and to criticize the president for not reaching it. At which point he decided that that was some stupid Democratic thing and he didn't want to have any part of it.
So
So
that's a
it was
very
very
interesting point.
frustrating.
When did Biden say nice things about your report?
Um, right, like a day or two after Trump had made this apparent uh, apparent embrace of the report, and from that point on, it just got worse and worse for us, and I ended up abandoning the effort basically.
And had you had communication with the Biden campaign?
Zeke Emanuel had been part of some of our initial work on this, and was following what we were doing, and I suspect that he relayed that to them. That we tried very, very
So
carefully
he
to
was the
avoid
front
that.
runner at this point. Did he have the nomination sewed up in April? I can't recall, but maybe not. But so
Uh,
I don't know.
I
Were there
think I think yes. I think it was
he
all
was
but because remember what
he was the
happened.
nominee apparent at that point.
Well, remember you'll remember that Bernie Sanders was way ahead in January. Everyone thought he was going to win, and then
Right.
there was a very quick process by which it went from
That's
that in
right.
February to
Yeah.
Biden being the presumptive nominee. So I think by the end of February, Sanders had very little
Yeah,
to
that's right.
stand on.
So it was clear that that Biden was going to be the nominee. So did you talk to that? Did you talk to the campaign and tell them to keep their powder dry and that or
We did not want to have any communications with people who were not representatives of the U.S. government
okay?
on the politics of all of this, because we were trying to work with the Trump administration and with select Democratic leaders that the Trump administration felt comfortable with in Congress. We did not want to be working in a manner that could create the partisan dynamics that ended up sinking our efforts.
So we know how the story went. Trump did not go for mass testing. Instead, he started just trying to discredit testing and slow it down. He
Yeah.
regarded testing not as a solution, but as a measure of the extent of failure. And so
Yeah.
the less testing, the better. And
But
instead,
that was not at all clear until about the middle of May.
right, right.
Yeah.
Um, but then also put all their eggs in the Operation Warp Speed vaccine basket.
Which is a fascinating story because it wasn't just Trump there. It was a attitude that we have in the United States that problems, to the extent that they're soluble, are viewed as technical problems, not as socio-technical ones.
Yes.
Socio-technical problems are viewed as insoluble and sort of either inevitable or trivial. Like either like, oh yeah, well, of course it's no problem, we can get that done.
Right.
Or they are just, well, there's no, that's always been that way and it will always be that way.
So
And yeah,
that to me is that's the at the heart of the failure here.
yeah,
the failure to take
Absolutely.
your advice was
Well,
just
the thing that's
a failure of imagination, right?
yeah,
We fell into this dismal false dichotomy of of open up the economy and let the virus run rampant versus uh, you know lockdowns forever. So
yeah,
we had one camp, let's ignore the virus, and one camp, let's hide from the virus. And
yeah,
nobody, except a couple of outliers like you guys,
yeah,
was saying, let's go out and beat the virus.
yeah.
Let's use our technology and organizational skills to do what other countries have done and get life back to something like normal. While we're waiting for a vaccine and treatments.
And Brink, as I'm sure you are going to be covering more broadly in your investigation of state capacity, that's a broader problem that afflicts American society. We've taken a very similar attitude towards the problems of our democracy as well, where some people think everything is fine. Some people think we need to just, go back to the way that things were or reverse this. Very
Right.
few people are saying, look, let's look to the international models. Let's solve the problems that we have in a consensual manner. It's like almost unimaginable that we can have positive progress in our social organizations.
Yeah. So when you look at various areas where American policy is really bad, to take another example, infrastructure. There are a lot of other countries that are doing things a lot better than we are. Countries that have social and environmental protections, but nonetheless can build things
Yeah.
without exorbitant cost and delay. And it's just there is a deep set parochialism in American policymaking circles that there is nothing to be learned outside our shores.
Yeah.
Um, it wasn't especially surprising to me that we didn't pick up on what was going on in Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there were other models, right? There was, as things went on, we saw the NBA create a bubble
Yeah.
and held their season, and then even more impressively, the NFL had testing protocols without a bubble and went through their whole season without any deaths and without missing a game.
And universities and corporations did similar
Yes,
things in various
universities
cases.
did, and then before the pandemic, we had buildings in pretty much every major city that are filled with people with infectious diseases, and they're called hospitals, and people go to work there, and they have protocols for staying safe and not getting infected by their patients and not infecting other patients.
But I have to
And
say, all these sub institutions, it was incredibly dispiriting. Took an attitude of, oh, we're very interested in your advice about how we deal with this and so forth, but they were unwilling to advocate for things that the public would do. I mean, Danielle faced this at Harvard, where she approached, leaders at Harvard to try to get them to take a public stance in favor of TTSI because it was profoundly in the interest of the university to do so. And they said, well, we'll take positions on affirmative action, we'll take positions on, whatever, because those are university matters. But this is a public policy matter. People weren't willing to stake their reputation. We talked to many nonprofit organizations, and we tried to get them, including civil rights organizations, civil liberties organizations, to say, okay, don't just critique possible digital tracing systems. Participate in doing it the right way and get the public support for them. They were unwilling to do that. They said, look, our support will come in the form of us not suing you in a couple of years. So there was a broad unwillingness of organizations to step outside of their lane in the public interest when a crisis came.
yeah, uh, so interestingly, so one institutional part of your proposal was to create a pandemic testing board. So to set up an institutional mechanism to coordinate all the supply chain problems and incentivize production of everything in the testing supply
And
chain,
make commitments to
to advance
purchase certain
purchase
things, and
commitments,
yeah, all that sort of
and so
stuff.
forth, right? So yeah, explain how that would have worked, because that sounds, and we'll get to it, but that sounds, similar to how Operation Warp Speed worked.
Yeah, I think it's not very different from Operation Warp Speed. It just was focused on a known problem and its logistics rather than an unknown possible technical solution. And the thing that's so sad about the vaccine outcomes is someone else will have to calculate this, but I wonder how many more lives we would have lost without the vaccine. I'm not sure that many. I think kind of the disease more or less did its damage. That's not completely true. I think the vaccine has saved a number of lives for sure, but I think it's certainly not an order of magnitude different. Let's put it that way. Whereas there are countries that are like 3 or 4 orders of magnitude separated from us in terms of the number of lives they lost.
Yes.
And I think the vaccine might have made 20% difference, 30% difference in the number of lives lost, but it didn't make several orders of magnitude difference.
So it's, I said the failure on testing was a failure of imagination, and yet it took real imagination to think on Operation Warp Speed, because your pandemic testing board is producing tests, and we know how to produce diagnostic tests. We've done that for a long time.
Yeah.
It's, of course, the CDC botched the initial COVID test, but there were lots of tests that worked. So the technical challenge wasn't there at all. It was just an organizational coordinating challenge to incentivize production at scale. Whereas, there had never been a vaccine created in less than a year before, ever.
But there's a profound difference, which is that the vaccine had this silver bullet-like quality, where if you just produce enough and you just get them in the arms, everything's fine. The testing tracing required you to understand a series of social relationships that would exist, where there would be these contact tracers, and they would be doing something that had conceptually the possibility of being invasive in some ways, even though I think everyone's kind of decided that was a red herring afterwards. I've heard almost no complaints about privacy violations for tracing, but there was at least conceptual issue there. There was a conceptual issue about his testing invasive. There were all these sort of thorny systems that had to be put together. It was much simpler to just say, you get a bunch of vaccines and you put them in a bunch of people's arms. That's stuff we do all the time, So there were these organizational challenges that were conceptually different than the organizational challenges of the vaccine.
Although somewhat less radically different than people thought. So
Yeah.
I think it's a really good insight that vaccines were privileged in the American imagination, because they were seen as a silver bullet, moonshot, purely technical exercise. But of course, yeah. So inventing and manufacturing the vaccines is a purely technical exercise, but getting them into people's arms is a socio-technical exercise.
Yeah, and I think we largely failed at that.
Yeah, and so when we got to the socio side, we
exactly. So we were extremely good at the technical elements of the problem, but because we thought the whole problem was a technical problem, we completely ignored the other things, and we didn't even learn the lesson from the first time around about the socio-technical problems. And then we botched the messaging and community participation and inclusion that would have been needed in order to get much more widespread vaccine adoption.
So tell me how the story ended, at least as far as your involvement. It would by May at the federal level, it was clear that Trump was against ramping up testing, and that wasn't going to happen.
And so I kicked around things for another month, and we did some things at the state level and for localities. But at some point, we basically had this analysis of there was a certain point beyond which testing and tracing were no longer useful, because the disease was so prevalent that there was no plausible case in which we were going to catch up with the disease before it sort of burned out on its own. And so at that point, once enough places tipped over into that zone, I just decided I couldn't do much good So I moved on to other things.
So, um,
It's a sad story. Yeah.
yeah, it is a sad story. So you've mentioned the role of politics, that the sort of inadvertent bad consequences of the Biden campaign praising your idea, uh, which meant that so the the purely political prism through which Trump saw the matter. How does this work for reelection? Um, but and but like, what were the political incentives to do the right thing? Um, one might think that that stopping a disease from killing nearly 1 million people now, as we're approaching the million mark in the United States, you might think that there would be huge incentives to save 1 million lives. Uh,
I don't
but,
judge Trump nearly as harshly as some do. I think there were some real limits on the information that he was both personally capable of processing and had created incentives around him to receive. Um, and that was very problematic. But I don't think it's the case that, like, I think he would have, if he had understood a pathway to solve the problem and heard it from people he trusted at the right moment, I think he would have adopted it.
so the point I wanted to make is, so he made a political decision.
Yeah.
He may have he was so extravagantly non-mainstream in his handling of the virus, of regularly downplaying it, and his crazy talk about ingesting bleach and so forth,
Yeah.
that he may have paid a price at the polls of a few percentage points that he lost uh,
Yeah.
because of his sort of cartoonish mishandling. But it's difficult to look around the world and see any politicians who paid a price for failure to protect their publics. So the governments that did a good job because they were dutiful and conscientious and
Hmm.
had the right idea and knew what to do. But nowhere, it seems to me, were people sort of pushed into doing the right thing by public demand. And
I think one could argue that Boris Johnson was temporarily hard hit by his poor handling initially of the disease. Now that was partly compensated by the fact that he then fell victim and got a lot of sympathy
right,
out of that.
no, that's fair.
Um, but I think that there was some amount there. I'm trying to think if there's any other examples. I think there may be some examples in Southeast Asia, um, that are a bit like that. But I would agree it's not, like, for example, it's shocking how little of a price Narendra Modi has paid.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah.
Um, and do you have any
Or
speculations as to
Bolsonaro
why that
actually is
is?
another example.
Well,
Yeah.
so is it so, like, in New York State, Andrew Cuomo, he had great press for a while and was lionized simply because he held daily press conferences and was mediagenic and played the part of a concerned, empathetic, decisive leader while he was sending infectious senior citizens back into nursing homes.
Yeah, I have to say, throughout that whole process, everyone was talking about how great Cuomo was, and we were interacting with those people, and I was not in the same camp as the public was, you know.
So was there So the problem in the United States is is the responsibility is all at the state level, uh, but we're a national market, and we don't have internal travel restrictions, and so it's difficult for one state to do the right thing for that to matter.
Yes.
Was If contact tracing was a bridge too far for American society, interstate travel shutdown surely would have been, even more unthinkable. But
Yeah.
in 2020, were you imagining a role for travel restrictions or did you think that was always impracticable, at least domestically within the United States?
Well, it was something we went back and forth on a lot. I think I ultimately thought it was going to be very hard to pull off what we were looking at without at least some temporary travel restrictions, at least for areas that were doing better, to show the value of doing that for a time before it spread to others. Because I thought if somewhere does better and they don't have travel restrictions, they're not going to get much of a bang out of that. And without that giving them a chance to at least demonstrate those benefits. Now, of course, Hawaii was a special case, but even there was all these people from California, rich people coming and bringing the disease. So it was, I worried that it was going to be quite difficult to, without at least some temporary travel restrictions.
Yeah, I don't know anywhere except China, that imposed really draconian restrictions on movement. Here, I'm in
Canada
Thailand.
did.
Here in Thailand,
Canada
they
did.
shut down domestic flights for a while.
Canada did.
Yeah.
Canada had interprovincial travel restrictions that were pretty strong.
Okay. So,
and by the way, that's another example of it. Someone who I think benefited. I mean, people have seen what a tough time Trudeau has had politically, and they assume that means that he didn't benefit. But I think that's a mistake. I think Trudeau was like on the verge of complete collapse, and I think the only thing that has kept him kicking along is the fact that he performed pretty well on COVID.
So we talked a lot about testing, but that's just the first part of the proposal you made. It was TTSI, testing, tracing, and supported isolation. If testing, which is the purely technical part of it, just ramping up the manufacture of tests at scale, the United States failed to handle that. But we didn't even come close to getting things off the ground on tracing or isolation.
Yeah.
Was it simply that by the time it was relatively late in the day, by the time your report was out, there was, it was in a lot of places, it was very widespread. The contact tracing would be a logistically pretty Herculean effort. But even if things had started earlier, it didn't seem like there was ever any. It was a kind of a fatalism that, well, we just can't do that kind of thing. Americans will never go for that right out of the box.
Exactly.
It seemed to me.
Well, so a few things happened. One is in Australia, they recruited something like 10,000 contact tracers that were laid off airline employees, or the furloughed airline employees, in like 2 days. It's a tricky job, but it's not one that requires an immense amount of ex-ante training to do, and it's a trivial expense. But we were never willing to repurpose the furloughed workforce in the United States in that way. We were never willing to think about a thoughtful balance we could strike between not meaningful personal invasions of privacy, but just like any disturbance of some sort of very extreme paranoid set of concerns about how this could be misused, which again, like I wish someone would hold to account all the people who were making those noises, because I haven't seen a single story anywhere. I mean, maybe I'm missing things, but I've never seen anyone be upset about the abuse of those testing tracing things. Not even some of the paranoid folks.
So tracing then had two modes. You could do it just manually, call people on the phone, and then there was digital tracing, and that was the latter was what really sparked the paranoia, right?
Even the former civil liberties groups were talking about, well, the AIDS pandemic, the epidemic, and how like the lives of gay men had been ruined, and as if COVID was analogous to a sexually transmitted infection with low infection rates among a minority that with historical patterns of discrimination. It was such a different
Yes.
scenario than that. I mean, it was just completely different. But people were conjuring up these slippery slope things.
And if contact tracing, which is just calling people up and saying, hey, you've been exposed to the virus, is too intrusive, then supported isolation is. I was involved. I was involved in the Niskanen Center and the Washington Post did a series of op-eds together where we would find people to come up with policy solutions that tried to transcend or bridge the left-right divide. And so I did one on. I found someone to do someone who had lived in Hong Kong and lived through their supported isolation experience to write about the need for copying that here. And it just was met with absolute and total lack of interest, right? It was just, there was no response to it whatsoever. It was as if the idea of, so, I mean, at one level, we had some kind of supported isolation in that we spent trillions of dollars in stimulus payments that allowed some people to stay home that otherwise could not have stayed home. But nothing in the way of directed, isolation of folks, and certainly no, for people who couldn't isolate at home because they would be exposing their elderly relative or their kids or whatever. No even rudiments of getting it off the ground to have facilities that could house people using, hotels that at that point had zero occupancy could have been repurposed. Just no thinking along those lines at all, to at least what I could tell. Maybe you saw more because you were closer.
No, I think there was very little. I also think that, like in China, I've heard that they've now completed several, like 30,000 person villages for isolation. Like there was nothing even contemplated at that scale in the US. And there's a bunch of other things that were like clear but uncontemplated, like rearranging the flow patterns of public accommodations quickly in the way that I think very gradually we got to and then quickly unwound, like making meaningful social, like that stuff all eventually started to happen in like the late fall, but like in Singapore it happened in 2 days, and that made a big difference to transmission rates.
So testing, tracing, supported isolation. Testing is the closest to being the silver bullet, purely technical challenge. So that's the part where now, in retrospect, looking at American culture, that's the part that we were potentially most receptive to. Whereas anything that involved novel forms of organization and coordination, people just threw up their hands.
And by the way, one problem we faced was that some of our potential allies on the testing front had this sort of libertarian attitude, and they didn't want to touch the other parts, and they thought testing alone could do everything.
Around the same time that you came out with the Safra Center report, Paul Romer, a well-known economist, came out with his proposal for massive scale testing at a higher level of ambition than the 5 million tests a day that you were proposing. And my recollection is that his plan diverged from yours because of his lack of confidence in American capacity to go forward with contact tracing and isolation. So the idea then would just be to completely blanket the country and test, so everybody can test every day, every time they turn around. And in retrospect, given now what you know about American society, was that a better idea than yours?
Um, I think there was physically no way to produce that number of tests within the relevant time. I mean, you literally, like, we've never managed to produce more than a few million tests a day. Now,
but I
at
mean,
least
we
there was a
could, right?
technical
I mean,
problem.
for
You could.
for
There was a
for a price
lot.
trivial in comparison to the stimulus payments and the
I mean,
economic damage.
there was shortages of various reagents. There would have been a lot of logistical challenges of distributing that volume of tests. Um, I'm not saying it's impossible. Like I think it's a reasonable option. You still would have had to deal with isolation challenges, right? Um, to make sure that people don't go out
But
once
if
they
you're
get
assuming that
test
most
positive.
people are semi-conscientious, and if they're sick and or if they're test positive, they're not going to go to work, especially if the
Hopefully,
if the
hopefully,
government
yeah.
support is there. Uh,
Yeah, but you can completely avoid the supported isolation component.
yeah. No,
So
clearly it would be leaky, but
yeah,
we could have been in a position where a lot more asymptomatic people knew that they had the virus and that they were
yeah,
transmitting it to folks, and some
yeah,
fraction of those people would have done the right thing, uh,
yeah.
and some fraction of those people were the super spreaders who accounted for you know some crazy disproportionate percentage of infections. So
I think once you take all those things out, like you probably would have had to test people a couple times a day. That would have meant hundreds of millions of tests a day, which is, 2 orders of magnitude, 3 orders of magnitude above where we ever got. So maybe it was possible, but I think it is quite speculative when you get to that level of capacity to say whether
okay,
that was within the logistical capacity. I mean, it was at a like fundamentally different level, and the cost also would have actually started to add up at that point. Like it would have cost, I don't know, something on comparable to the cost of the stimulus to do that level of testing.
so that all makes sense. What about an even more rudimentary mass scale response, which is just flooding the world with PPE, making sure everybody's got an N95 mask, a moon suit if necessary, at least all the 40% of people who had to continue going to work because they were working in person. Make sure everybody that worked in the in a Walgreens or in a grocery store or in a meatpacking plant was had hospital quality masking.
I mean,
That
it's
was that technically
certainly.
doable?
I think that should have been technically feasible. Yeah, I don't think that that's like a overwhelming logistical challenge. That's like a one-time supply of a very large amount of equipment, and there were some supply chain issues, but they weren't as severe as the reagent ones. Um, so I think that should have been feasible, and I think that would have done something. I don't think it would have suppressed the disease, but I think it would have done something.
So when you look back, was there anything you could have done different?
Yes, we could have at the very start had a much more focused understanding of navigating the politics than we had. We took primarily an intellectual, inquisitive approach, and I think we should have, from the start, had our eye on how we were going to navigate the politics much more crisply.
And if you had had your eye on that, how would you have presented things differently?
I probably would have been quite a bit more secretive. I would have had a much stronger Republican hue to the whole look and feel of the thing. It
Coming
came
out of
off
Harvard,
as it came off
designed
as
to appeal to the Trump
center
administration, right?
with a tiny bit of right, but we should have been much more, and we tried later, but we didn't try soon enough um, to get that balance. And then we should have hit the president from every conceivable angle we could find, um, and ignored pretty much every other approach. Now, some of that we just didn't know. Like the CDC turned out to have been almost unimaginably incompetent and ineffectual and unable to communicate with people in relevant positions of power. And we weren't counting on that. We thought that if we like just got to a reasonable person at CDC, we could do the numbers with them and they would agree and they would pass that up to, Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Fauci would be our ally on this. But that
I
that
mean, if they
wasn't the
had been a
dynamics in
competent
it.
organization, they didn't need you. They would have already known all this, right?
Yeah, I think, it's almost inconceivable to me that they hadn't at some level figured this out, but they were deliberately trying not to ask questions not directly posed to them because they were trying to protect themselves. So there was a weird game of chicken where the White House was afraid of the CDC and the CDC was afraid of the White House, and neither was actually communicating with the other.
So this gets to the issue of just the quality of public health expertise in public health institutions. So you're a social theorist with an economics PhD. Danielle Allen is an academic with a PhD in classics and a PhD in government.
Yeah.
How did you two outthink the entire American public health establishment?
I don't think we outthought anyone. We just thought more broadly and more integratively than other people did. There were economists who were taking for granted the disastrous nature of the disease and talking about stimulus. There were logistical people taking for granted the demand from the government and trying to satisfy that. There were um, public health people taking for granted the basic policy trajectory and trying to make do with what they had. There were all these people who were staying in their lane, and we didn't stay in our lane. We tried to actually put the pieces together, and in principle, that's the role of like the White House or whatever. But it wasn't in this context going to be executed by that function within the government. So it took someone who was willing to step out of their lane and put the pieces together.
So, I mean, there had one can understand how different, specific agencies in the government are siloed and have tunnel vision, and that's why you need some sort of high-level coordinating function. But the White House set up a task force by the end of January, so they had they had uh, the idea of a task force that can cut through red tape and ask the right questions to get to the right answers. But you know, why were you so lonely?
Unfortunately,
Why weren't they just besieged from every quarter with, well, my God, you just have to do testing and tracing and supported isolation. That's what's effective everywhere.
I think the insularity of the American public is part of it. It's it's not only in politics that we fail to communicate across lines of authority and difference. I think it's true in the academy. It's true in many other areas of public life. Even for our effort trying to get the public health people to spend the time to realize that like communicating with people from other fields might actually get them what they wanted more effectually than just working on their narrow problem was very challenging because all the institutional incentives were there for them to just publish papers on the topic rather than try to you know solve the problem at a macro level. And no one had confidence that you could solve it. Everyone assumed that nothing can ever change at a macro level within the US system. And so
So, what do we
yeah.
do next time? This isn't our last pandemic. Uh, what what institutions in the government need to be created that don't exist now? It seems to me it seems foolhardy to imagine that the CDC could be reformed. You just need to start over with another. So the CDC seems like it's very good at sort of taking information from other people and producing high quality retrospective research. It does a good job at those things, but being a warfighting agency,
Yeah.
it doesn't have any competence at all. So who can be our where is our pandemic fighting capacity that can see this as a challenge to be won and surmounted, that can see it the full integrated problem in all its technical and social dimensions? Where where should that be housed, and what kind of people are in that agency?
I don't have a clear answer for you to that question. I'm not totally sure, but I do think that you need people with a sort of entrepreneurial spirit, with a tight integration and sort of finger on the pulse of civil society, and with a lot of flexibility to try to aggressively solve problems that, as you find, not even in general in the private sector, but in certain entrepreneurial organizations, like Elon Musk's operations have a lot of that character to them. You probably need things of that sort. Audrey has done a phenomenal job seeding things like that in Taiwan. I'm not sure how we get there in the US. I think one hope, I think our best hope actually is in many ways is the current situation in Ukraine, because I think that what Vladimir Putin didn't figure on is that no matter how internally divided and incoherent democracies can be, common threats have a way of mobilizing decentralized activity rapidly, and I think we're seeing that now. And somehow, COVID was not understood that,
but only common human threats, right? We had a common threat in COVID, and it did not bring us together.
But the benefit of that is that sometimes the institutions that you set up in those contexts can work for other things as well. And I think during the Second World War and during the Cold War, there were several examples of that sort.
Well, you've mentioned something to be as a possible ray of hope, and there haven't been many of those in this conversation. So maybe that's a good place to stop. But if there's anything that you want to add as far as wrapping up, feel free to. But
that's great.
Okay. Well, thanks a whole bunch, Glenn, for taking the time.